Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today. Hi, everyone. We are back for season 2 of the Cinematography Salon podcast. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who's listened along so far and reached out to one of us saying that you enjoy the show. Your support and taking the time to contact us really means a lot, and it helps this project stay in motion. Today, we have an extremely exciting episode and some exciting changes to the format of the show. This episode marks our first episode of season 2, and we are beyond excited to welcome the incredible Ava Benjamin Shorr as the new co-host of season 2. Hello, Ava.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Very, very excited to kick off the season with you. And since Oren was such an integral part of launching the show and shepherding season 1 into existence, it seemed like the right fit for us to welcome Oren back as a guest for the first episode of season 2. Quite a lot has happened for Oren between when we finished the last season and now, like the release of The Creator, which was directed by Gareth Edwards, who is known for Star Wars Rogue One, Godzilla, and many other amazing films. It's been incredible to watch as The Creator has really taken the world by storm, garnered so much amazing press and attention, and we are just so excited and proud of Oren for having DP'd the project in collaboration with Greg Fraser and Gareth Edwards. We're super excited to dive in today and hear about Oren's experience working on the project. This episode will act as a breakdown, which is a little different than our normal format, and we're just going to be focusing exclusively on The Creator since we have so much to cover. Welcome, Oren.
Hi, it's so weird to be on this side of things, but I love it. I'm happy to be back and welcome Ava. This is so cool and so fun.
Get ready for a world of pain. There's a lot of revenge that
I'm ready.
Yeah. Bring in the heat. Yeah.
I'm in the hot seat now.
Thank you for coming on. And yeah, we were talking about it a little bit before we started recording, but it's just been a blast absorbing all the content coming out and getting to see these amazing interviews with Gareth and getting a peek behind the curtain of the movie. Yeah, we've obviously all seen it and it's amazing and we're so excited to talk about it. So I wanted to just start by exploring some of the more philosophical aspects of shooting this project. I heard this metaphor of a home in a couple of things that I was reading about the project, and I just thought it acted as such a beautiful metaphor for the approach of how the film was executed. And the metaphor involved Greg Fraser's comparison of treating cinematography like painting a house, or the production designer James Klein's comparison of constructing a 2-story house from the top down. And yeah, I'd love for you to just explain the significance of the meaning behind some of those analogies, because when I heard them, it just felt like a really valuable insight for any cinematographer to kind of think of approaching a project in that way, or kind of think about designing a project, shooting a project in that way.
I love it. I love that you honed in on that. Honestly, I never thought about that connection of the experience of making the film feeling like a house. If anything, it felt like, when you're driving on the highway and sometimes you see like a mobile home on a truck bed being transported and it's just a whole house driving on the highway. That's what this felt like. It was a house on wheels moving at 80 miles per hour. But yeah, I love it. I mean, Greg's analogy really said it all. He was specifically talking about the lighting approach, but honestly, you can expand it into the whole filmmaking approach for the project. And I think maybe the biggest takeaway for me from the film is this idea of like approaching prep as not necessarily about planning each individual moment. It's more about creating fertile ground for creativity. And the way that you do that, basically the analogy of painting the house is that if you put in the time to like move all the furniture and tape up the outlets and pick your paints and pre-mix them and roll out your roller, you take it out of the plastic, like have all the tools kind of at the ready and prep your whole space. The advantage of that is that you can then start painting whatever wall you want. You don't necessarily need to start from, I only prepared this wall, so I need to do this first, and then you keep prepping as you go. We never discussed that analogy in advance, but when I heard Greg say it that way, I'm sure he's used that before. It all, in hindsight, like clicked, like, oh yeah, that actually really makes sense. Because like I said, he was using that to describe the lighting approach, but I think it really applies to like the prep approach for the whole project and sort of how we chose the tools and hired the crew and scouted and prepped for the whole thing was about just creating the conditions to be able to paint whatever wall we wanted.
I'd be curious to elaborate on that a little bit. I myself have shot 3 narrative features, and there's been different approaches that we've taken to shot listing and constructing each of them. Some have been heavily storyboarded or shot listed, and some have been extremely loose. So this movie to me has such a organic style. I'd be curious to know where you guys fell in terms of shot listing. Were you thinking about lighting setups ahead of time, or were you discovering that on set?
Yeah, so basically, this movie did not have a traditional shot list storyboard approach that I've experienced in past narrative projects, mainly because Gareth, as a director, just came to the table already having thought of all that stuff. And also because he's operating the camera, he doesn't even necessarily need to communicate a shot list to anybody but himself, really. So basically, we spent most of prep scouting and talking. Greg, Gareth, and I talking, looking at reference images, figuring out what we wanted the film to look like, and getting really granular with our reference study. And again, Gareth really came super prepared here in a way that I've never encountered before. Like when I came on board the project, he sent me a link to Dropbox. And this Dropbox link had folders for each location in the film, basically. And I don't mean the shooting locations, but the scene headers in the script. So it was like No Man's Land, Lilat City, the AI lab, Joshua and Maya's house, like all the different locations. And each folder had like 1,000 reference images that he had been collecting for years. And he collects reference images from a bunch of different places. It kind of feels like a magazine collage of cutouts sometimes. There's like low res stuff that he screenshots from Google. And then there's like really high res stills from Shot Deck. And there's stuff from Pinterest. There's photography. There's like photos of photography books. There's old concept art from past projects. It's like a huge mix. So we just poured over the reference images and talked in detail. Like we would pick a random folder and be like, all right, what do we like about this image? Is it the contrast? Is it the positioning of the key light? Like we were just trying to get as specific as possible. And then just to train ourselves, basically, like training the eye and the brain on like, what are we looking for? What are we reacting to? What do we like? So that dovetails with the scouts. We scouted pretty much all of our locations. We shot in 80 locations around Thailand. So you can imagine how much of our time in our 4-month prep was spent scouting. And I also joined like a month into the scouting. So Gareth and the producer and location manager and production designer had already been scouting for a month before I even came on board, which is crazy. But yeah, we were just on the road pretty much like most of prep. And we had the camera with us because we bought the FX3 and Gareth owned the rehoused Koa lens that we shot on, or that was one of our lenses that we shot on. So we had the same camera and lens we were going to shoot the final movie on with us at all times. And he also had some cheap LEDs, like battery-powered LEDs that he bought and brought with him. So we carried those around as well. They're just small little sticks that you can put in a backpack, basically, and just charge them overnight. So when we were scouting, we were already starting to basically build out the visual look of the film on location. The stand-ins were usually like the AD or a PA or somebody. So, you know, it's not the same thing as being there on the day with an actor and the costume and everything. But at the very least, every location we approached, we would start thinking about how would we shoot this? How would we light this? What are the hero angles? Like, what are the angles where this location looks best? And, you know, and assessing the available light, like what's already here, what can we use? So all of that is already being processed during the scout. And I'm keeping track of it all. So I had a document that I made for each location. And I was pulling the reference images that we highlighted from our conversations, and then also photos from the scouts and also the stills from the scout footage. And I put them all in. And then I would write little notes to myself. And then that document was shared with our gaffer. And so it's still instinctual, but we're trying to do as much of the instinctual part of the process during prep. That's the moving the furniture and taping up the walls portion of the prep. You know, what outlets do we need to tape up in this location, metaphorically? What that means literally is we're already starting to think like, okay, well, this location has these practicals and then there's these ones back here that are going to be flat if we shoot in this direction. So like, okay, we'll turn those off and then we need to black out this doorway and we need to add some practicals in the background there because it's sparse. or, okay, well, we can put light through this window or whatever it is. Like, it would differ by location. Gareth is also already thinking about shots during those scouts because you're starting to identify the angles where the locations look the best. Gareth would show up every day with a shot list, but nobody would see it. It was basically in a notes app on his phone, and he would do the shot lists in the van ride to set every day, basically, for each day. And it was really, I think, just an exercise for him to think through the scene and make sure that he's covering himself, like that he has at least some reference point of these are the beats I need to hit. But on the day, we wouldn't really discuss the shots. Like, it was more just something that was in the back of his mind. And maybe occasionally at the end of a scene, he would check and just like look through and be like, okay, I got that beat. I got that beat. I got that beat. Okay, I'm good. And I did eventually see the shot lists. He did share them eventually, but it was really, they're more beats. Like, it's not shots. It's not, medium push in of this, It's like, it's actually lines of dialogue. It's like, I need to make sure that I'm getting this beat. I need to make sure that I'm getting, like, the shot would just say like interaction between Joshua and Alfie. Like, I need to make sure I get that. Or it would say like a line, like implying that we need to get a close up of it. But yeah, it was just really organic, and it was completely different than any prep shot list visual approach that I'd ever had on another film.
It seems so liberating, like, to work like that, and for your role to become more of creating that space. And I think that's where that metaphor of kind of painting the room just makes so much sense. And I feel like it's such a great way to describe this process, because it's like, that's challenging. It's like, it's challenging to create the circumstances for a director to feel confident enough to walk in with a camera and can live shot list and focus purely on performance and things. And I can imagine that when other directors hear about this approach, I'm sure their eyes light up and they're like, wow, that's like the ultimate playground to work in, to have to be so supported by your crew and by your cinematographers, to be able to just kind of like literally step into the world. It's just, yeah, it's a really fascinating approach.
Yeah, it's funny. It didn't feel challenging. Like, it actually feels very liberating and organic and easy almost. Like, it's very instinctual. But what I would say is that it's risky. And I think that that's probably what trips people up, is that it's a risky approach. And I think that the reason we were able to get away with it is because we were empowered and emboldened by Gareth, because of the way he wanted to shoot the film, to lean into that stuff and to accept, knowing this was a huge conversation that all three of us had all through prep, Greg, Gareth, and myself, was embracing imperfection as an asset and understanding and accepting that this approach will have casualties. Like, the lighting is not always going to be perfect, and that's not only okay, but that's the point, because that's what makes it feel more organic and more real and more lived in and more believable, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, one thing kind of feeds into the other in that regard. Like, the approach only works if you let go of that part of you that needs everything to be perfect. But that was sort of the big conversation from the get-go, was like, we want it to feel rough and tumble a little bit.
For people who don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of the VFX process and are maybe just hearing this for the first time, like, I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about the lighting approach specifically, and, a theme that has come up on this show quite a bit with cinematographers and directors and creatives in general is the value of kind of observing the natural world and being present in the face of beautiful natural light, and being able to have all of your equipment and everything tuned and ready to go. But not only that, it's just building a reference well in your own mind of things that you're drawn to. And I loved in the previous response when you were talking about how you guys just developed a sense of what felt right for the palette of the film, what felt right for the visual effects that would eventually work its way into the sets and everything. So yeah, I'd love to just hear about how kind of observing the natural world and witnessing the surroundings of the beautiful area you shot and stuff worked its way into the visual palette of the film.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's just no better light. And by the way, I'm including practicals in the natural world, quote unquote. There are some artificial settings, cities, huts, villages, that also have beautiful available light that isn't necessarily the sun. So I'm kind of clumping these together, but when I say the natural world, I also mean artificially lit spaces that were not lit by a movie crew. Anybody who's done any street photography knows that there's just so much beauty in those types of environments. And sometimes you have to look for it, because not every environment inherently has that. If you're out on the street and it's noon, you're probably not going to react to the same way that you would at golden hour, or, at dusk under the light of like a single fluorescent in a gas station in the middle of the desert or something like, but we all know, and we've all been, or like the soft window light in a castle or some other interior location like that that's naturally kind of very gloomy and single sourcey. Like, we all have been, I think, in those situations. I mean, if you do any type of street photography or even just casual photography on your phone, like during your travels, you've encountered these types of scenarios. And I think our thing with the Scouts and everything, I mean, Gareth's original inspiration for the film was some of these locations. The house that Joshua and Maya start the movie in, the opening scenes, Gareth stayed in that house 5 years ago to write the script. It's just a rental property in Riley Beach in Thailand. So, and he traveled around a lot, like, while writing the script. So a lot of the visual inspiration for the film is based on real places anyway, that we then kind of went back to film in, essentially, like years later. And of course they are unchanged because that's how these things go. And so I think like the big mandate for the location work was, like, you're casting your locations the same way that you're casting actors. I mean, you can't just shoot anywhere. Like, it's very obvious when you step into a space. And by the way, we scouted a lot of locations we didn't film in, because like part of the scout was looking at locations that had already kind of been selected. And part of the scout was, hey, there's some locations in the script that we don't have a space earmarked for. So let's go look at some options. And there's some options that you look and you explore around with the camera and you're looking for good lighting and you're looking for opportunities, and you just realize, like, you know what? There's nothing here for us. There's no interesting compositions. The space is too small. There's no depth. There's no interesting geography. The available lighting is crap, like whatever it is. And so there's a lot of spaces that we eliminated from consideration for those reasons. So I think that's an important part of the process as well, is curating and selecting the locations. And it's really like casting the locations. And it's picking places that are already giving you that natural beauty for you to then lean into.
Yeah, well, I guess getting into some of the specifics of lighting, I kind of heard rumors from someone that like the biggest unit you used was like a 1200 aperture light. But what's interesting to me is that I think regardless of the camera you would use on a movie, you still need larger lights to create, say, like a very big, believable, soft window source. Your like M40 to your 18K, like something in there to still create that beautiful soft window light or direct hard sunlight. So I guess I'm curious to like hear if you used any larger units to emulate natural light. And then kind of additionally, this is something that we had talked about privately. You'd kind of fallen in love with this 3/4 uplight.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd be curious to hear where that came from and what tools you used to like achieve that.
The FX3 of it all is what allowed us to use the 1200 aperture. Like, in other circumstances, we would totally put an 18K outside of a window or a 9K or something to get that kind of soft window push. But on this, we were able to do that with the 1200 aperture because we were shooting at 12,800 ISO. And the goal there really was just to keep the footprint small. Obviously, the minute you are dealing with 18Ks, you're dealing with Jennies, you're dealing with cables, you're dealing with 4 grips that need to even just lift the light up onto a stand and all that. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted the lighting approach and the camera approach and everything to be as low footprint, quick, nimble as possible in order to shoot the film in this way. And we knew that we could do it. Like, it was just about leaning into the tools that we had. And we did day play a couple of bigger HMIs for the night exteriors. I mean, we still mostly lit with the 1200s, but some of the night exteriors, I mean, I can't remember, to be honest, but I don't think we had anything bigger than a 4K. And then, so that was only a few days. And then there's the space shuttle sequence where they're on the shuttle. We shot that on an actual airplane that was like in an airplane hangar. And we wanted to be able to brightly light up the whole side of the plane so that it felt like harsh sunlight. So we had an 18K on that day to create that kind of really, really hard, punchy sunlight effect. And we had it quite far away from the airplane. And we also had maybe like 30 sky panels that were just side lighting this plane. We essentially had to treat it like a stage shoot because this plane was in a hangar. So like there's no natural light really for us to use. So we had to kind of build it from scratch. And then obviously for the Pinewood shoot, we shot in London for 2 weeks on stage. And that was very traditional. You would walk past carts with hundreds of cream source vortexes. And you're just like, why are these all even here? Because the ones that are already in use like are in the ceiling already. We had these big soft boxes and also like a ring of them around the whole perimeter of the stage that were lighting the gray screen. There were hundreds. And then we used a lot of them on the floor to create the glow of the earth. So that was a mix of a lot of vortexes and digital Sputniks that were basically just shining down onto the ground. We had a ton of them, and we laid down like big blue, kind of sky blue tarps and a little bit of green as well to get that kind of earth color. So that's for all the scenes where Josh was like climbing on the outside of the nomad structure and that kind of stuff. So those were bigger lighting setups, but we always talked about it like a balloon. The default state of the crew is a deflated balloon. It's minimal, it's small, it's lightweight, and then every once in a while we had to inflate the balloon and bring in additional crew and bring in condors and bring in lights. But those were the exceptions to the rule, and we would be very careful with our planning of when we needed to day play stuff like that. The uplight, we discovered that during test shoots around our production office, and it was something we just stumbled upon. I mean, it came out of looking at the reference images and noticing that a lot of them had this uplight, and then we were like, oh, that's so interesting. That seems to be this recurring thing in all these reference images. Like, we should try that. And so we tried it, and originally we were doing it with a direct light. And this is with our, if anyone's read anything else about the film, Gareth has loved talking about our best electric Nancy with the boom pole. And she had a Helios tube on the boom pole. And that was like our main key light basically for the whole film, which is accurate. But we started by trying to shine that directly. And it just feels sourcey. Like, it feels really obvious that there's a light source there. But then the minute we just started shining it away from the actor actually and just bouncing it off of the ground or bouncing it off the wall or the environment, and then suddenly it felt real. Like, it feels really, really good. And then we just tested it in a bunch of different environments, like shooting scenarios. This was all before we started shooting. But by the time we started filming, we knew that worked. So we just tried to do it as much as possible. And to be honest, I wish we did it more. Like, there's shots in the final movie from the first 2 or 3 weeks of the shoot where I felt like we weren't bold enough with getting that light in there. So there's lighting that's a little bit less refined. And as the shoot progressed, we got bolder with getting that Helios tube in. So the lighting gets more refined chronologically in the shooting order. But of course, in the movie, it's all jumbled together, so you can't tell. But I can tell because I know what order we shot things in.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think one thing I think about is like a parabolic fixture, and how a parabolic fixture is, gaffers will like wince if you ask them to put diffusion over the parabolic, because the parabolic is a convex shape, and the actual shape of the light is like a 3-dimensional shape that's then reflecting onto kind of like a concave human face. And like what I heard you describe in some of the articles about this with the bounced light, it's not even just about making it softer. It's about allowing the light to work its way into all the 3-dimensional nooks and crannies of your set, reflect off of wood grain, reflect off of water, reflect off of maybe lasers that are in the shot. And you're getting a way more volumetric return from the light that is wrapping around the talent as organically as part of the environment. And I think that conceptually, and like the fact that you all were able to align on like the physics of how the light's reacting in the space and those things, is why I think it works so well. And I think it's super fascinating. And I love how, with the mention of Nancy the Electric, and how she had the fitness armband with the iPhone on it with the monitor, and like those sort of tactile tricks and those things in order to sneak things in there and get that key in the right spot is just, it's super smart. And it's just as a testament to like some of the more innovative approaches on this. And I think the uplight specifically too just feels so much more intimate and draws you in so much more. And it also makes sense to me that that came from references, because I think that that is something that's sort of inherently sci-fi. Like, I think that you run into uplight a lot more in sci-fi references, because often it's fixtures on tables or fixtures, you know, on ships or things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of it in Alien.
Totally.
Which is probably where we pulled it from initially.
I guess one question I have, just kind of hearing you talk about the 12,800 ISO, is, you know, you've mentioned in other press surrounding this film how with the FX3, it was just a matter of checking a few boxes for quality and then just moving on from that point, not ever overthinking it and not ever like worrying too much about the intricacies of the technical, and just making sure it has the 15 stops of dynamic range. ProRes RAW will hold up. VFX is happy. You can maybe print it to film, maybe grade it digitally. But I guess my question is, even with all that in mind, were there ever times where you felt like the highlights were at risk, or that 12,800 ISO was in some way risky from like a noise floor perspective? And like, how did you navigate that? Like, did you always have kind of like a, in the back of your head, like, oh, we'll denoise this, or did you not even have to consider those things? Like where did you feel like you were pushing up against the limits of the format after committing to it?
Yeah, we definitely felt that. We had the advantage of having Photochem backing the whole project. So we had an on-set dailies colorist who's at the hotel at the end of every day. So anytime we had any concerns about anything we shot that day, I could just go right into the color suite and look at it right there. And then we also had Dave Cole, our colorist, in LA at Photochem, and Greg. And that was actually one of the big roles that Greg played, was that sort of quality control when there were certain situations where, due to circumstances outside of your control, like maybe we're just shooting way past the point where there's enough dusk light to see anything, but we're getting some crucial stuff in that window. And we want to make sure we have it, because those are very bold choices and decisions made on the fly where you're sort of like, well, look, we're not going to stop right now. We're not going to stop and light this scene. We're just going to go with it. We're going to go with this dusk, and we're going to trust that we know the camera. And then we're going to check later and make sure that we got what we needed. So yeah, that happened a few times, but the camera surprised us all. We never really bumped into any situation that we couldn't address with Photochem. I don't know how else to put it. I think it really shocked everybody. Anytime you brought that stuff in, you're like, nope, there's enough there, and we can denoise it, and it looks good, and that's it. And
So
concerns are assuaged. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, that like you always had the sort of infrastructure of Photochem and know your colorist and those people backing you up and checking that. That's not, of course, always the case when you're just
exactly.
running a gun. Like,
I think
so
that's the key to it, is that you set yourself up to be able to be bold in that way and to take those risks, because you know that you have, at the very least, a checksum. Like, it's not necessarily a safety net, because you're still making the bold decision, but you know that there's a whole team behind it. That, I mean, the honest truth is there were certain situations where we were like, well, we're really losing the entire background here because we've lost so much ambient light. And so worst case scenario, I can like bring in the little Helios tube and light the foreground a little bit so we get something on the face, but we've lost the environment because it got too dark. Worst case scenario, back of our pocket, ILM can replace the background. That's what I mean, is that there was always some lever we could pull. Like, if for whatever reason that shot made it into the movie and it didn't have the background and they used that take in that moment, it was fixable. Like, there was something you could do to make it work. And yeah, I think without that, it's harder to take those risks for sure. Without having Photochem, without having Industrial Light and Magic, without having Greg as the sort of like backing it up, without all of these things in place to protect the choices, it would be a lot harder to make those choices for sure.
I think a big thing that was reported on with this film was kind of how it was an $80 million budget and appeared to be so much larger than that. And I think it was totally to the credit of Gareth for understanding how to optimize this budget range that you were in and knowing where to put the resources and how to allocate in the most efficient and creative ways. And so I thought it was really refreshing to hear that like Gareth almost felt a little embarrassed that the project ended up costing 80 million, and the embarrassment stemming from his desire to keep the costs even lower. You just don't necessarily hear like directors with this kind of access and these kind of resources talking in that way. And I thought it was really cool. So I don't know, I think it reflects Gareth's kind of humility as both a director and a producer on the film. And I think to me, it shows that he's prioritizing storytelling above fancy tools or tricks or things like that. So I just was curious to hear how that mindset and how that approach affected what the filmmaking process was like. You know, I've heard you talk about these amazing stories where instead of doing a whole car rig that can roll on a gimbal inside of a studio, like Gareth just rotated the camera, and like they're just amazing stories. And I just think it's such a cool testament to how this process probably felt. And so I'd love to hear you just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we could have done it for less. It's a lot of that cost was COVID, to be honest. It's a big chunk of budgets of films that were shot during that era. And if we did that project now without COVID restrictions, it would have been less. This ties into a bigger conversation, which is like the state of the industry. We're in this place right now where studios are making these big blockbusters that cost like $300 million. And if you watch the movies, it doesn't necessarily show up on screen. And this isn't to like throw any specific movie under the bus. And it's certainly not any filmmaker's fault. Like it's the fault of this system. And there's so many inefficiencies in the way that big films are made that it's stuff that honestly ends up getting in the way of creativity, to be honest. And the reason it's all there is for insurance. Well, it's actually even simpler than that. It's like line producers, film producers, exec producers, department heads, they have all worked on past projects and they have done past projects a certain way. And so when they sign onto a new project, there's constant conversations about like, well, when I worked on the so-and-so movie, we did it this way. So that's how we're going to do it because I know that works. And that's how you end up with $300 million budgets, is because you're building on other films that cost $300 million or $250 million or whatever, like going back. It's just a system that keeps building on itself. But there's so many inefficiencies in it. Anytime you're shooting a dialogue scene between two characters on a location that isn't a big set build or anything, and you have 400, 500 people around doing nothing, that's an insane amount of waste. And it should make people feel guilty, I think, to like walk past that. I mean, Gareth felt that our footprint was still too big a lot of times. And it was out of our control ultimately because the film was produced in partnership with a Thai production company. And they also have a way of doing things, and we're in their house. So we kind of have to do things their way, at least in terms of production and production support. We shot the movie the way that we wanted to. Like our on set was the way we wanted it to be, but the base camp, for example, and the logistics and all of that was very much done in a traditional way. And it's just done in the way that this production company is used to doing things, which is the way that everybody does things. So like, I'm very happy that we were able to kind of deliver on the mission statement with our departments, because we really did kind of expand and contract the metaphorical balloon of the lighting department, grip department. Camera team always stayed small. And we almost always worked within the tools and the limitations of the tools that we had. And we expanded only when absolutely necessary. But, I have empathy. Like I understand why other departments have their ways and needed their resources and wanted their resources. But that's the point, is like, that's why it's so hard to cut these costs, is because everybody is used to working a certain way and is comfortable working a certain way. And I just admire Gareth and Greg so much for like, even just questioning that stuff. It's surprising to me that more filmmakers who work at that level don't, because I'm sure they're all thinking it.
I think that brings up a really interesting thing that I've thought a lot about this the past few years, where the director, the producers, and I would say even to some extent the DP, they have such a large role in shaping the tone of the project.
Yeah.
I think especially on like a personal project, and I would put the creator in that group. And I think that you do have so much leverage to prioritize certain things over others and to shape the community and the style of the set that you're on. And I think something that is really interesting about this project is Gareth does seem to me to be someone who has such a understanding and a mastery of like different aspects of the filmmaking process. And I'm curious to hear how working with someone who, the only word I can really think of is an auteur, or someone who is like so involved in every aspect of it, how that maybe changes the director's relationship with everyone. And then also, I guess you as a DP, this probably, I'm going to assume, used to operating the camera. Like, how does that change your process as someone who is no longer operating? What does that do to the team to have someone who is so hands-on with everything?
I mean, to me, it was pure bliss, honestly, to the point where I feel genuinely nervous and worried about the next project that I take on. So I'm like, what is it going to be like? It's almost weird for me to imagine, because I haven't done a long form narrative project since The Creator. So I haven't really been in that position yet. I mean, I was prepping one earlier this year, and even already there was starting to feel like, oh, this is really different. And that one ended up going away. But yeah, I'm really worried for myself. Like, how am I going to cope with going back to a director who isn't as hands-on? Because it becomes so second nature that you really start to think, well, this is just what directing is. This is what directing should be, I think. And I think I'm going to stand by that for the rest of my career, is like, well, I think directing should be a director comes in and has a vision and has already made their shot list and knows what film they want to make and knows what they want to shoot and understands film language and cinematography and at least understands the other departments enough to be a guiding force behind them and not just sort of like throw their hands up and say, well, you know, you do whatever you want to do. Like, that's not directing to me, because if I have to come in and help block a scene and come up with the camera angles, I'm kind of co-directing the scene. And I don't want to be a director. That's why I'm a DP. So I don't know. I think maybe I just got too used to it, but that's how I feel about it now, is like, and I've been lucky. I've worked with other directors before who have come in with that vision already in place and who come in with a shot list already completed. You know, we'll go over the shot list. We didn't on this one. It was just a different approach, different circumstance. But like on past films where I've worked with these kinds of directors, like we'll still go over the shot list. We'll talk about everything. But I feel like there is an expectation within me now that that's something that a director brings in. And that if they're not fully fulfilling the role of director. It's tricky because, like a great AD, for example, can really help with blocking as well. And one could argue that also should just be the director's job. But ultimately, the AD is there to support the director, the same as the DP is. So maybe that's okay. Like, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, certainly, directing background and blocking, like staging of a scene is very much the AD's job, like especially the second AD's job. And, that is specific blocking and directing that the director does not usually get super hands-on involved in. I don't know. I think I'm still, my thoughts about it are still evolving, but this experience was definitely very eye-opening in that regard and ultimately like very pleasurable. The truth is I don't love operating, and I do it out of necessity for multiple reasons, mostly because it's more efficient. Like if you have a certain thought or idea about like the pacing of a push in, or if you want to be able to react spontaneously to what an actor's doing by operating handheld, then it's just easier for me to do it than to try and communicate with somebody else. But I know that there are operators out there, like professional camera operators, who are smart and good enough and have enough taste that you can trust them to do that. I haven't found them yet, or I just haven't been in a position to like hire enough operators to like try and look for the ones who are that level of brilliant and that you can trust in that way. But I would prefer to work that way. Like I would much prefer if I could just work with somebody who could totally get the vision and get the approach and then just have them operate so that I can focus on the lighting and the big picture and just like look at the whole image, which is what I rather do as a DP. It was really eye-opening and it was really inspiring too. It's sort of like, this is what directing should be. Gareth, sometimes on the van ride to set or even on the scouts, he would just be sitting on his laptop designing some logo for, like, there's an ice cream delivery guy in the movie for like one brief scene. And the art department is already just so overwhelmed with all these big projects that designing the logo for the ice cream company was pretty low on the priority list. And so Gareth's like, I'll just do it, because he likes doing that stuff. So he designed the name of the company and the backstory and the logo and all of it. And it appears on the ice cream box, on the bag, like the delivery bag, and on the delivery guy's shirt. And that's the only time you see that logo. But that's why he did it, is because he was like, I realize this is insignificant. So I almost feel bad asking the art department to like spend all these resources working on it when I can just whip it up. And he has a background in graphic design and in industrial design. So it's like right in his wheelhouse, and he can whip it up quicker than spending a week back and forth with the graphic designer in the art department doing it. Because that person already had their hands full with plenty of other stuff to work on. So it helps so much. I mean, it just feels really comforting and really reassuring to have somebody like that at the helm, because you just trust that they have it. They have it. You don't ever feel unmoored to anything, which I feel like I've felt in the past on some other projects where you're sort of just out there untethered and you're like, I don't know how this scene is going to cut. I don't know how this is going to work in the edit. I don't know how these shots connect. Like, I just don't have that trust. And here we just had it the whole time. And that it just let me do my job with less anxiety. I mean, there were other anxieties, but less anxieties about that, about trusting that the end result would not be like to the level that we all expected. And it turned out that it was.
We are very excited to announce our partnership with SanDisk through their Relentless Reliability campaign.
A big thank you to SanDisk for your support. Their extreme portable solid-state drive is a staple on film sets and a tool that I've come to personally rely on. SanDisk leads in drive and memory card technology, emphasizing not just storage, but everything worth keeping.
I think there's like an interesting thread here that is really fascinating to me. And I think I just want to like elaborate on it a little bit. And we don't have to like really delve into this too much, but like, I think that when I am working with directors that maybe are not so savvy about the visual construction of a piece, you know, it's less like a judgment that I have, but more so like I feel like you're relinquishing some of the power of the art form. Like film at its core is a camera and actors or environments, and there is film or there is a sensor picking up movement. That is like the core relationship. And I think that one of the reasons why we remember certain movies is there is, I think, a construction that is channeling emotions in such a profound way. And I think to not at least seriously consider what is going to happen on that level, I think is maybe like diminishing how much you as the director can impart the emotions or the psychologies or your conceptual ideas into a narrative or into a project. So, you know, I think I've worked with some younger directors and I feel like, you know, who maybe they just don't really have a full understanding of, you know, camera and all that stuff. And I sometimes find myself being like almost an educator. And which is interesting too, if you think about it, like Greg Toland educated Orson Welles, you know, and look at Orson Welles' career after that. He was forever influenced by Greg Toland. And I think that, you know, as DPs, we do kind of have this interesting relationship where sometimes we are working, like I have worked with directors who I go, you are such a master of like visual storytelling. I'm like in awe of you, you know, and then I think there's other times where you kind of become more of the like sort of educator and like handholder. And I think I'm always thinking about how do you give the director more tools to not rely on me, but to make the decisions themselves. Now, I think in commercials, I don't know how much time you have to do that, but narratives, you can maybe like nurture that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I think also what's interesting is that if you're working with a director who is not going to be so didactic about the shots that are going to be seen through the camera, I think at least there are other ways to approach it. And I think a film can be made so many ways. And I think that one of the things that you touched on about creating this foundation of what intuitively is right, I think can go a long way in at least allowing you as a DP to make choices that you think can be right for the project, even if the director is not like, well, I think this close-up should be 3/4 or profile or straight on, you know. But I do think that like really the films that we remember a lot of times are these ones that have this stamp of a director who is in complete control over the film itself is like being wielded by someone who really knows how to like manipulate the form, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I think you really tapped into something here. And I guess this is what I'll say is directing is very amorphous and it's one of those roles that technically anybody could do. Like you don't actually need a ton of technical training to direct. You need to be a people person. You need to know how to talk to people. You need to have charisma and confidence, and you need to know how to engage with an actor and understand the psyche of the actor, at least a little bit. But none of that stuff is stuff you necessarily need to study. Like you can just have an inherently good read on people. And I think that that makes like fertile ground for being a good director. But I think that the one thing that you absolutely need is taste. You need good taste and you need to be confident in your taste and you need to know what you like. I think it's perfectly okay and understandable, especially for younger directors, to not know all of the technical ins and outs and to not necessarily know, yeah, like if we use this lens, it will do this to the image. But what you do need is exactly what you said, which is like you need an understanding of the construction of a film. Like a film is a construct and it's constructed from all the elements that you said. And you need to know as a director how those elements fit together and how to orchestrate them and how to bring on collaborators who can maybe help bridge the technical gaps in order to do that. Now, all of that said, and also everything I just laid out already is like, there's a lot of directors out there. I'm not throwing any specific person under the bus, and certainly nobody that I've worked with, because I've actually been very lucky with the directors that I've worked with. But there's a lot of people out there who don't have that. They don't have that ability to understand the construction of the film. And then that's how you end up in situations where there's indecisiveness, there's insecurity, there's tension, there's unpleasant shooting experiences, and there's bad films that come out of it. Like, that's how it happens. And now the other opposite of that spectrum is that I will say, like, I think the great directors, like the best of the best, the ones that made all the movies that we love and admire and that have stood the test of time, like the Scorseses and the Kubricks, etc., are the directors who do have the full control and the full understanding of the entire approach of filmmaking. And they don't just understand the construction from a rough sense, they understand it from a very specific technical sense. To me, Gareth is one of those directors. Like, he is Spielbergian in his holistic understanding of the filmmaking approach, film language, how to construct a film, how to operate on set, how to get what he's looking for, how to move the camera, everything. To me, the best of the best directors have that. And I do think that that's stuff that can be learned. And I think that that is stuff that can be learned from DPs, from the collaborators that you bring on a project. Like, if you are a young director who maybe isn't fully well versed in that side of things, like, you can acquire that knowledge and that experience. But I do think that doing so is what unlocks that Denis Villeneuve level of just being fully in control of your craft and in control of the filmmaking process in general.
I feel like the way that you've both referred to this is so brilliant in terms of like the construction and how necessary it is for a director to have a specific taste and a specific point of view. And I feel like the way that that is then unlocked is when they're able to convey that and democratize that information clearly to all the different channels. And I feel like what I heard earlier when you were talking about the scout process and the way that Gareth assembled wells of references and wasn't in any way tyrannical or ego-driven in the choices. All of this taste and all of this construction wasn't in a silo. It was open and available to the team to like absorb and adapt to and to riff off of. And I feel like...
And to contribute to. That's the big part of it, is and to contribute to.
Yeah, I just think that's so inspiring because, yeah, it seems like that's kind of that final step. You understand all the different departments. So technically, you've created this beautiful sort of construction. You, like you said, you understand the psyche of the actors and everything. But then it's like, until it is spoken to the team, it's just all in their world. And yeah, it's really cool to hear that someone like Gareth is able to kind of share that and collaborate in that way.
Yeah, and by the way, a big way that he's able to do that is because he's a producer on the project, and also the methodology and the approach to making the film was a part of it. That was always a part of the pitch. And I think for him, a big component of making the movie was also about how we're going to make the movie and being able to set the terms for that, because that's how you create the fertile ground for everything that we've been talking about. Because I think that a lot of times, even like really good and well-meaning directors, if they relinquish that control, for example, like in the studio system and on these bigger films where there's maybe already a system in place that you are just stepping into and you don't have that ability to control it, it easily just gets out of your grasp. And so Gareth, he said something in an interview where he was like, if I had a choice between being handed a brilliant script, but being like, all right, here's your budget and here's your crew and here's how you're going to make the movie, because we've made a film like this before and we're going to do it the exact same way, versus maybe I have an okay script, but I can really create the approach and create the grounds on which we're going to make the film and really control how we're going to do it and what the experience is going to be like of making the film, he would always pick that over relinquishing control over the filmmaking process. And I think that that's very telling, because it's acknowledging that there's these certain things that you need to do in order to create the environment where you can empower your collaborators, you can share a vision, you can operate with confidence, you can take risks, and ultimately also like you can get what you want. You can get the look that you're after, and you can get the images that you're interested in and that you gravitate towards as a filmmaker, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's very much what we did. And I think that was a big sticking point when he was pitching the project, was like looking for the right collaborators that basically would just say like, yeah, here's the budget, and also make the movie the way that you want. We trust you. And we were so lucky because New Regency was that like the whole time. They just trusted the process. And that takes so much guts. Like I have so much respect for it.
One thing I wanted to touch on, and we could touch on it kind of briefly, but I think that something that I'll come across sometimes is like when you're being asked as a cinematographer for like certainty surrounding something. Are you certain this location will work? Are you certain this camera setup or this lighting setup that you're deciding on is going to work? And I think that the promise of certainty is such an elusive thing, but I found it so interesting hearing about the process with Gareth, where like he would almost go out of his way to provide that certainty to all departments of the shoot, whether it was maybe the people he was answering to on a funding level or the people he was collaborating with on the creative side. It was like between the proof of concept sizzle, this sort of tech scout approach, all these really cool, interesting things that you've talked about with like this $5 LUT, just all of these things that was like, this is what I'm looking for. And I can show it to you, like pretty much a close approximation of what I want. I can imagine that that was a really refreshing environment to work in versus maybe sometimes not knowing what someone wants or maybe having to, yeah, like we've just talked about a bit, like filling in those gaps or having to kind of overextend in certain ways. And so I'd just be curious to hear briefly about what it was like and how that maybe differed from other things that you've worked on where you had such a clear directive and such actual tangible footage on the same camera and lens, like you were saying, that you could kind of riff off of and work from.
The lack of certainty was definitely the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process because at any point it could have failed. There's elements of it or things that we were going to try that wouldn't work, and then we've sort of already burned the ship. So we're committed to making it work with what we have. And that can be for better or for worse. I mean, it's only possible when you have people like Gareth setting that tone of expectation, because he's setting it on himself as well, you know, which I think is the important part, is that he's not just sitting back and orchestrating this whole thing and just allowing department heads or crew to like succeed or fail. He's also in there. He's operating the camera. There's a lot of times that he'll do a camera move and it fails, like it doesn't work, or like he misses a pan. You know, he's trying to pan with something and he misses it, and then he's kind of like cursing under his breath, like we all would in that scenario. But I think that maybe is part of why it works, is because he's also putting himself out there. We're all sort of walking this plank together a little bit, which maybe is what makes it reassuring. Like it's still scary, but you're like, well, if we fall, we're all falling together, and there's no room here for like finger pointing or blame or anything. And I think that is comforting enough to like just push past it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, look, you know, the other thing also is with prep, you can prepare backup plans and stopgaps. And, you know, I mentioned earlier, like the ILM thing, like we were always like, okay, well, worst case scenario, we can always activate visual effects to help something that wasn't working.
So, Oren, I've heard you talk a bit about your perspective around the FX3 on the shoot and how it's sort of the least interesting aspect of the film. And it makes total sense to me. Like, I feel like Ava and I got an insight into some of your technical approach like way, way long ago when you were working on this film in the early days. And even then I was just so excited to see the end product and wasn't super taken by the technical side of it and everything. And so I just think that, yeah, it's inspiring to hear your perspective on that, because I think that it's a great example of how technical is really secondary and it's really more about the director's point of view. And I think it's easy sometimes for people to fixate on technical details because maybe they're just too afraid to like think about the essence of the film or the POV or however, you know, what kind of message the director's trying to convey. And so I'd love to kind of hear your personal thoughts on what drives Gareth's interest in these subjects and what narratively inspired you about the film and really had you flipping the pages of the script and excited you in the early days. And also, as you've seen it be released on a grand scale, theatrical scale and everything, what that response has been like for you.
It's a great question. I mean, look, I grew up like a sci-fi nerd, especially sci-fi films. So I think first and foremost, the thing that I responded to more than anything was just the world building. The script was awesome. I mean, ultimately, the script is pretty simple. It's a basic story structure that, you know, it's Lone Wolf and Cub, and it's like Children of Men. It's like basically the same structure. Last of Us, like this story structure is a trope. I mean, and it goes back forever. Like it's essentially an Odyssey. So in that regard, like the script was more just the vessel for what I was really responding to, which was like when I came on board the project, that he sent me the script, but also a bunch of concept art. And I think a big way that Gareth thinks about movies is through concept art. His process is basically like when he's even just starting to think about a movie, like during the script writing stage, on this one, he reached out to a bunch of concept art friends, and also just he reached out to artists that he had like been following online, and was just like, hey, I'm in the early stages of working on this movie, and here's the setting and here's the setup. I'd love to commission some pieces, and gathered all of this great concept art, a lot of which is in the art book that's coming out in November, the Art of book for the film. So you'll get a glimpse into it, but there's it barely scratches the surface. I mean, there's like hundreds of pages of concept art. And I think that's what excited me the most is you look at the concept art and you're just like, wow, this world is just so interesting and beautiful. And the juxtapositions, like every image in the concept art has an interesting juxtaposition of technology and spiritualism, or like modernity and old and new. And it's just such great images, like such vivid, great images, some of which are in the movie, some of which are like 1-to-1. Like if you compare the concept art and the final movie, it's the same. And then some of which is like very different. And by the way, this is all inspired by George Lucas, because this is how he created Star Wars. Like the script of Star Wars was less important, I guess, than the world building. And a lot of the world building and the concept art process on that with Ralph McQuarrie, who's the artist who did all the Star Wars designs, happened before there even was a script. He was just responding to conversations with George about the world and about the vision of the world and like the juxtapositions. And it's sort of the same thing. If you go back and look at the Star Wars concept art, some of it is like 1-to-1 with stuff that's in the movie, because the final designs were very much inspired by that art. And then some of it is like, oh, wow, this isn't in the movie at all. Like they went a completely different direction, but they built a world. Ultimately, that's what was the most interesting thing to me. And I think that's the most interesting thing to Gareth, is building a world and then taking you to that world. And the story and the characters are the vessel into the world. And you don't just want to go to the world and look around. Like you want to feel something. So you want to be taken on a journey. So there's an emotional core at the center of the movie that is designed to hopefully move you, so that while you're experiencing this world, you are, going through some sort of emotional journey or change yourself that is reflected through the world. But the funny thing is that the specifics of the story don't matter. Like you could have done a different story structure in this same world and it would have been interesting. Like you could approach this film from a bunch of different ways. You could do a different story structure. You could do, instead of the lone wolf and cub narrative, you could do a classic revenge story. You could do something like Gladiator, which is like another archetype. Or you could do the classic hero's journey like Star Wars, the scrappy farmer who gets caught up in the thing and goes through a journey with a wizard who trains him, and then he refuses the call but eventually is the hero. Like that's the Star Wars Lord of the Rings structure, Harry Potter. Because to me, like all movies are archetypes ultimately. All stories are archetypes. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with existing story structures and existing character archetypes and that kind of thing, because those are the things that bring me into a story. And it's more about like the execution. How are you using that story structure to say something? And how are you subverting it or providing like your unique take on that structure? And what kind of world are you taking people to through that structure? And what are people going to learn from that world? And this movie just like ticked all of those boxes for me. I mean, it's about so many things. Like it's about colonialism. It's about scapegoating the other. It's about fatherhood. It's about accepting responsibility. It's about second chances. All that stuff is in there. And I think you as the audience member can sort of choose what to fixate on. There's different things that you can respond to here, all of which are there, all of which are in the text, all of which are in the subtext, all of which are in the actors' performances, because they've all thought about this stuff and created their backstories. It's all in there. And to me, that's just what's beautiful about cinema. And the thing about the film that it has been a little bittersweet is just seeing like some of the reaction to it, not to get too far into this, but like some of the reaction to the film has been a little disappointing in that I feel like people don't see movies that way anymore. There's a lot of emphasis now on logic and lore and backstory and like, oh, well, this thing doesn't make any sense, so that's a plot hole, and that ruins the movie for me. Like that takes me out of the movie. And this is not new. Like this has been, I think, since the internet age, really, like since, I don't know, blame CinemaSins. I call it the CinemaSins effect, but it really predates that. Honestly, it predates that. It's just to me, it's the wrong way to watch a movie. That's not what movies are about. That's not what stories are about. Stories are not about internal logic or reason or lore or that kind of thing. They're about emotion, raw emotion, and the journey that you take an audience on and the world that you transport them to. And that's what's important about stories. And that's what I responded to in this film.
Such a beautiful overview. Thank you. Yeah, and I think like seriously, that was awesome. I think I was really taken by the performance. Like speaking of a vessel for this approach was the performances were so raw and so beautiful, and I think the way you said it was totally totally
Gareth is
accurate.
an underrated director of actors, I think, because what he does is very simple. Is he just empowers an actor to bring themselves into a role. So like there's a lot of improv that happens, for example, like with dialogue. So it's not improv with storylines or blocking or anything like that, but specific lines. You know, there's an encouragement to be like, just forget what's written in the script. Just say this the way that you would say it. And I think John David this is like his best performance because he brought a lot of himself to it. There's a lot of JD in the character and in his mannerisms and in his personality. And that's what makes it a good performance because it feels real. And Madeline, the little girl, is like just a revelation. And none of us know how she acts. Like none of us know how she accesses that. I mean, she was 7 years old when we shot the film, and it's just still crazy to all of us. But yeah, that was really the case with everybody. And I think that Gareth is really good at that. We had actors from a ton of different countries in the region, like a lot of Thai actors and Vietnamese and Japanese, obviously with Ken and Hindu. And everybody was just encouraged to be like, we want this to be a reflection of you. Bring your own personality, speak your language, just speak Vietnamese, just speak Cambodian, speak Thai. It adds to the tapestry of the world when everybody is just bringing that authenticity. And we don't want anything to feel forced. We don't want anything to feel artificial in the performances, in the world building, in the cinematography, all of it. It just needs to feel real and transport you.
Was there any particular storyline or character that you saw the most of yourself in, that you really connected with when you read it?
Another great question. I mean, I think Joshua is sort of designed to be the audience surrogate. You're supposed to connect with him the most. And so I think just the way it's written, I mean, there's all these side characters, but ultimately the movie's a two-hander. It's like there's Joshua and Alfie. So I think it's inevitable for everybody to see something in Joshua that's like a mirror of themselves a little bit, even if it's something subtle. So I think that's sort of my cop-out answer. But I don't know if I could even articulate specifically what it is, but and you know what, like maybe it's what John David brought to it, because I ended up relating with him a lot. Like he's a movie nerd and a geek, and we in between takes we would just talk about movies. He's obsessed with movies and the film industry, and like follows the trades and the news sites and the announcements about upcoming projects and box office and all this stuff. And like I'm a nerd about that stuff too. So even just at that level, and he's a very ambitious person and driven and humble. So it's like maybe that's what I was reacting to, was an aspiration of the type of person you can be. It's like not even the character, it's just the actor. But yeah, I don't know. I think that was definitely the easiest person to connect with, I think.
An image and like a performance that stuck with me so much and still has was Madeline climbing out of the escape pod and that circular window out into the destruction of the rocket trails and the destruction of the Nomad. And then I guess the ending shot of the film, like her performance of that, the sort of horror to the kind of hope, was just a breathtaking performance by that actress.
It's perfect, right? It's so good. I love that final moment. We shot that pretty early in the schedule. So it was, I think that was like her first big acting moment where she really had to like deliver on, I mean, they obviously saw in the auditions what she was capable of. Like they, auditioned and rehearsed these emotional scenes. But that was the first time we did it on camera. So it was sort of like a lot riding on this, and it's at sunset. It's in golden hour. This is a narrow window, but we rolled camera and I think we shot for maybe 15 minutes and just repeated that shot over and over and over again. And every time just slowly coaxed a little bit more out of her and just got her a little bit more comfortable. And actually her laugh at the end, it's so sweet, but her laugh at the end is because she's not acting in that moment. So she's acting, she's having this like emotional reaction. And then the take was over. We basically said cut. And then the whole crew like applauded and was cheering her on and being like, Maddie, Maddie. And then she laughed and she gave that smile, because obviously we kept rolling because we're not stupid. And so that final moment of the film is she's not acting because she was like cut was set. So she's turned off acting mode and she was now just reacting to like the crew. And yeah, that moment with the window is that's my favorite shot in the movie. And it's a total accident. We basically shot her whole re-entry sequence in one shot. And it was because we were like at the end of the day and some other scene. This was in Pinewood on the stage. So they had built the escape pod and it was sort of on its side. It's like at a 45-degree angle. And we had been shooting a bunch of other stuff that day and it went long. There's stunts. There's a lot of complicated stuff that we shot during those 2 weeks. So we went late and we didn't go over, but we just went later than we wanted to on the other stuff. So we had like 30 minutes to get this entire scene of the re-entry. And it was one of those things where the AD is like, hey, well, look, we can always punt it, which we do throughout the schedule. Like sometimes you just don't get to something. And that's the advantage of shooting a 90-day schedule is you can punt it. You can just say, okay, well, listen, we're just going to take this scene off today and we will find a space for it a month from now. So we were like, listen, we can always punt the scene. Like we'll find a spot for it next week and da-da-da. And Gareth's like, no. We're here. It'll disrupt the plan too much for the rest of the 2 weeks. We had a very specific plan of what sets needed to be on stage at what given time. And this was the day for the escape pod. They set it up. We built it. We had a lighting plan for it that we talked about in prep. So we were like, let's just do it. It's 30 minutes till the end of the day. Let's just roll the camera. Let's just like not cut and get everything we need in these 30 minutes. And so that's how we did it. We rolled for 20 minutes and just the whole re-entry we just did in one go. Shooting out of Nomad, the reflection, and then like, okay, Maddie, strap yourself in. And then now it's re-entry and they're shaking the whole thing and they're shaking the gimbal. And we did this whole multi-level lighting gag where, she starts in space and then re-enters the atmosphere. So there's an ambient light that kind of comes on. And then we wanted the sun to kind of go past her face. And then there's an explosion and then she lands and then the door opens. So there's a light gag there because you wanted to see her shadow and like see the light sort of reveal her. And then she climbs out. And we just did it all in one go. And it was handheld. And that reflection was just an accidental moment it's just one of those things that you find, like you just shift your weight and you're like, oh, whoa, there's something here. There's this reflection here. Ooh, let me get this shot. And then she was crying, but you couldn't see because we were on her back. And then you just see her crying in the reflection. I mean, it was just magical. It was exhilarating. And it was just like indie filmmaking on stage at Pinewood with all these lights and this big crew and everything. But that was the perfect encapsulation of the film. Was like, we're just going to do it. Like, we're just going to beast through this and bang it out before wrap and just throw everything we have at it.
So cool to hear. Wow.
I think one of the remaining questions I have for you, Oren, is a little bit about the origins of the film. And I guess even though the film, as we've talked about it today, is kind of this smaller blockbuster, you had told me some anecdotes when we were hanging out together that it was actually meant to be even smaller.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I was curious to know if you could share with us what the project actually was when you signed on and how it evolved into the thing it is now.
Yes. I mean, the hilarious thing there is I feel like everybody I told about the project as we were making it or right after had this idea in their head of what it was based on my descriptions, that it was this like super small, scrappy thing. And then the first trailer came out and everyone who I had told about the project was like, wait, this is what it is? This is huge. Like, this is massive. That's crazy. This is not what we pictured at all when you were describing it to us. And I'm like, yeah, I guess fair enough. Maybe I downplayed the scope of it. Cause like we all knew that was the scope of the final film. Cause we had all this concept art and we had the script. And I mean, all the stuff that happens in the film is in the script, like all the set pieces, everything. And actually one thing I didn't mention earlier is that there were 5 sequences in the film that were storyboarded, and it was the set pieces. And those storyboards were done really early in the process. Like they were done years before we filmed. So to the point where the character designs, they don't look like the actors or anything. Like they were, I think, purely done as part of Gareth's prep process to just get something down on paper. And I think also to help pitch the project, like they were part of the pitch materials. And actually, I think the special edition version of the art book, like the collector's edition, I think comes with the storyboard for the third act came in a comic book form. Like it wasn't a storyboard, it was actually a comic book. So it was like comic book frames with speech bubbles and everything. And I think that comic book is part of the collector's edition of the art book. Like you actually get the comic book of the third act of the film, which is really cool. Anyway, all of that stuff was boarded. So all this to say, when I came on board the project, we knew what the final scope of the film was going to be because you could tell from the boards and you could tell from the concept art. But the unanswered question was like, how are we actually going to structure the shoot? How scrappy is it actually going to be? And when it was originally pitched to me by Greg, the way he described it was like the way that Gareth shot Monsters, his first movie. And the way that Gareth shot Monsters is they had a crew of 10 people total, including the actors who also did a lot of double duty. And they basically drove around. I think they had 2 Sprinter vans or something. And they drove around Central and South America for like 4 months. And they would just shoot on location, sometimes without permits, sometimes just paying somebody $20 to like shoot in their backyard. It was very scrappy. They had a sound guy, Gareth, operating the camera. He was his own DP. He was his own gaffer. They had producer Jim, who also produced this movie, which was a great full circle moment. They had the 2 actors. They had like a wardrobe makeup multi-hyphenate person and like a local fixer. I think that was probably it. So we talked about Nomadland. I was talking with Greg and Gareth and we were like, oh, I know some of the people who worked on Nomadland. Like we should talk to them. And I think Greg's worked with Chloe on some commercials as well. That's the scale that we were talking about. Nomadland, for people who don't know, was shot kind of similarly. I think it was a 20-person crew. And it was pretty much exactly what I just described. It was like a longer shoot with a small crew, and they just drove around and shot with like no lights, very minimal crew, as minimal as possible, no big G&E crew, no lighting, no big support team, just a handful of people. And they went to real places and they shot real people and natural light environments and all of that. So that's the way the project was pitched to me. And that they were then, much like Monsters, because in Monsters, all the scale and scope is added in post. It's all CG that Gareth did on his own in After Effects on a laptop in his bedroom, as he says. So that was the concept here, was that we will add all the scope later. And we're going to shoot it in this way that is really just super scrappy and very minimal. And I think the realities of it just set in over the 6 months that went by between when we had that conversation and when we started filming, which was just that it was going to need more support for many reasons, like extras, stunts, SFX, costumes to dress all these people, art department to spruce up locations and create like extra props and all this other stuff. But the funny thing is like you just see how quickly it snowballs because that was never the intent. But then each one of those things just ends up being like one little crack in that approach where you're like, okay, we're going to do it super, super small and scrappy, and we're just going to be driving around in vans and we're not going to have all the support. But somebody needs to kind of take care of the wardrobe and put the actors in it and da-da-da-da-da. And then you're like, okay, well, now we have a whole team for that and makeup and, oh, we're going to have like 100 extras on set this day, so we're going to need to costume them. So we're going to need to make all those costumes and we're going to need to dress them on the day. And you could just see how quickly it expands. And that's, I think, going back to what Gareth was saying in those interviews where he's like, we could have made it for less, is because I think there's another, hopefully there will be another attempt, I mean, his next movie, whatever it is, at this methodology again. Like, you know, I think we all would totally do it again and maybe learn from what we did this time around to like push it even further.
Yeah, you said it perfectly when you said that. When that first trailer came out, everyone was like, what the fuck? It was pretty wild.
Yeah. Well, we knew that's where it was going the whole time. I know I maybe undersold it when I told people about it early on or even just when I was describing it, because sometimes the things you describe sound like the scrappiest little indie film. And it sort of felt like that a lot of times on set, but we always knew what it was going to look like at the end.
Definitely captured lightning in a bottle, which I know was a goal.
Very much so.
So in closing, I was curious, Gareth was quoted in an article saying that, you know, and he's someone who I think thinks very technically and thinks in computer terms and things like that, which I love. But he was quoted saying, when a film is finally over, your brain can suddenly dump 2 years worth of ideas and images in a heartbeat, like formatting a hard drive. You find yourself suddenly with this massive blank canvas in your mind. So just reading that, I was curious where you're at in that journey on this project. And have you sort of formatted your mental drive with this film, so to speak, yet? Or what will you take with you and what excites you moving forward after having accomplished this incredible feat?
That's a great question. It's a good quote. I think where I'm at right now is that process happened. And now it's actually been really fun plugging the hard drive back in and looking through the photos that are on there that I haven't looked at in a year and being like, oh, wow, those were good memories, or that was really interesting. Like, I think the process of making a film of this scale and the timeline of it was new to me. So I had sort of been away from the project for like almost a year between when we wrapped and then when we started the color grade. It's about a year. And in that time, I saw a couple of cuts and, I chatted with Gareth a few times, but it's very much like you sort of move on and then you come back to it. And now I think the fun part for me has been, first of all, just being able to like appreciate the film as a viewer, because I'm a big viewer of movies and a lover of movies. And so being able to take that step back and assess it as like, did we accomplish the goal of making a movie that I would want to watch and that I would be proud of as a film lover? And I think the answer is yes, which I'm very happy about and proud to say. But also just doing this and like reliving the process and maybe sharing a little bit of the process, since it was so insular this whole time. It was something that was so private between the people who worked on the film, and because we wanted to kind of keep it a little bit close to the chest until the film was out and then spill all the beans, which we've been very happy to do, and sort of let people into the process a little bit. It's been fun to revisit it because you sort of pick and choose the stuff that you think is interesting and that stays with you in terms of the process, and the stuff that you think is interesting to pass along. And that just helps affirm it in your own head. There's stuff in the movie that we did that I still haven't talked about, that at some point somebody we'll just sit down and go scene by scene. And I'll it's just some stuff like you don't necessarily remember or think about all the time to like bring up in these kind of scenarios, but there's like really cool, fun, scrappy things. Like, honestly, the best format for it would be like a commentary track. Like, if I could just commentary track the whole movie, like in real time, and just explain like, oh my God, okay, this scene. So this is what we did. We did this, this, and this, and it was really cool. Or really scrappy, or really strange, or funny, or odd. There's a lot of great anecdotes for each scene, and it'll be fun to keep sharing it, I think, because it's fun. It's a really fun part of the process. That I'm really into education and talking about this stuff and sort of breaking down the barriers and the gatekeeping and all that. So to me, this is a really rewarding part of the process. Maybe the most rewarding part about it is to be able to share it and to be able to share the experience and to have the film out there. Like, the film is done and it exists in the world, and I helped make it. And like, that's just so gratifying to be able to say that.
It's been very invaluable and inspiring for all of what y'all have shared. And I feel like the fact that it was original IP, which we didn't even really touch on, but of course is known, and the fact that you guys use so many innovative visual techniques and are open about sharing that information has been inspiring to me, and I know for a lot of other people that I know. So thank you so much for taking the time today, and I look forward to hearing the commentary track. And you should be incredibly proud of this. So congratulations again, and thank you.
Yeah. Congrats, Oren. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, y'all. This was fun.
Yeah.
Talk soon. This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Ava Benjamin Shorr, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave and edited by Corey Abel. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the Salon community for supporting our efforts with this show. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Able Cine for their continued support. If you're unfamiliar with their offerings, Able Cine provides services such as equipment rentals, sales, maintenance, training, and much more. Additionally, they host complimentary events at their various locations. For more details, please visit ablecine.com. If you enjoyed listening to the show, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.